That's the problem.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Ethan Bonanno-Mesquita. I'm a faculty member and the interim dean at the Harris School. Really glad to see so many people here, and I know online as well, to talk about these important issues about civil-military relations, the role of the press and the military and the public in our public life and in our national security, the hard issues it raises, and how we can do better. So we're gonna have a great panel to talk about those issues. Hoping we're gonna have a robust discussion. We're here at the University of Chicago, where we take very seriously the injunction from John Stuart Mill that the best way to get to the truth and the right way to live is to have a diversity of opinions and fight it out. So I'm hoping that's what we're gonna do. Hoping our panelists are gonna have things about which they disagree and which we can have a lively discussion. So before we jump into that, let me introduce our distinguished panel. Michèle Flournoy is a co-founder and managing partner of WestX Advisors and chair of the board of directors for the Center for a New American Security. She's a founding member of the War Horse, and she previously served in a variety of important roles in the Defense Department in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, including serving as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2009 to 2012. Rajiv Chandrasekaran is an award-winning journalist and a best-selling author who served as a senior correspondent and associate editor of the Washington Post, and we'll talk more about his experience covering war and conflict. And Thomas Brennan is the founder of the War Horse and a veteran of the Marine Corps, served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Thomas studied investigative reporting at Columbia at the Graduate School of Journalism and has been instrumental in making today happen. So really happy to have all three of you with us. So let's get to it. I'm gonna try and help us think through a variety of issues with our speakers, and I think we're gonna start in on a couple issues that were raised by the white paper that really inspired this event, or helped inspire this event. One about sort of the relationship between the civilians and the military, the way the press covers the military and how that affects our public life, and the other about the role of the press in national security and the way we think about the relationship between the press and the public and national security. So I want to start with this question of civil-military relations, military life, and the coverage of it. And Thomas, maybe you can kick us off a little bit. So I think a big theme of the white paper was that lots of important stories about military life, about the life of veterans, about the lives of military families aren't being covered, or aren't being covered in the correct way. It talked a lot about this idea that sort of press coverage tends to focus on some familiar cliched tropes about either broken warriors or American heroes. So I'm interested in your take about sort of what's the right way to be covering these stories? What makes a story about military life, veterans' lives, and the like newsworthy? What are we doing wrong, and what are some examples of how we could do better?
Thank you. Very nice question. I think that one of the best things that we can do is report on the individuals that serve and the individual military families. Right now we're witnessing the political drama is dominating the headlines. Meanwhile, we have military families facing food insecurity. We have military spouses that are battling record high numbers of underemployment and unemployment. And we're seeing arguably one of the worst recruiting crises that's hit the military in a long time. And meanwhile, we're talking about political drama instead of important topics that impact our national security, impact communities all around our country. So I think that really the way moving forward is to focus on the individuals that choose to serve instead of where we see too often they're used as scapegoats to vilify the institution. I think overwhelmingly the individual wants to make the institution better, and by focusing on those people, I think that we can highlight some of the solutions that they have in mind.
So Rajiv, you've both covered military affairs for a long time and also been in leadership in the journalism industry. Are those stories newsworthy, and if so, why aren't they getting told?
They are incredibly newsworthy. It's these days, sadly, I think it's a challenge of attention and resources. Let me just step back. I'd like to put this in some context because, I think back, kind of 20 years ago today, and at a moment when there were quite literally hundreds upon hundreds of American journalists focused on covering aspects of military affairs and at this point, 2-week-old military incursion into Iraq. And we started, if we take an arc of those 20 years, that was a period of resourcing and attention, but of one where there was a real paucity of understanding and awareness. And I will put myself in this category. I had never covered major military operations before. In all honesty, I often confused, an Army captain with an Army colonel. And I just, the basic things that so many journalists didn't understand about our military, but thrust into this. We go over a period of some years with, we saw this as an evolution in our military. Our soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors got smarter about what they were doing there. Their awareness increased. So did that of those covering the war. And in my view, the quality of the coverage increased year over year. But where are we today? We're in a place where we have essentially the bottom has fallen out on the business model for the news business, and an audience is fragmented. And so while we have, for those who are sort of still in the business of covering military and veterans affairs, or those who cut their teeth over the past 2 decades at this and still have some of those skills, there just isn't both the resources in major newsrooms to sustain this, and some of that is driven by just how audience and the business model has fallen apart. I felt we had a sort of a golden era, maybe kind of 10 years ago or so, where you had that, the bottom hadn't fully fallen out, and you still had resourcing, not just in the largest of newsrooms, New York Times with its war blog, with the Washington Post, other large newspapers were doing, but down to even local newsrooms. Those local newsrooms, over the years, as we know, have shed not just military reporters, have shed reporters covering education, covering local government, and many of them have shut down entirely. And so when we look at this, it's, in my mind, it's not just a question of are these stories relevant, but how do we find ways to sustain the actual reporting and storytelling? Because even if you've got relevant stories, but you don't have the resources, you don't have the way to aggregate eyeballs to get on them, they're never going to break through.
Can I push on this
Please.
thread a little bit? So it seemed, if I think back, during the height of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, obviously there was a ton of military reporting in the sense of coverage of the war. And that included important stories about the lives of the military in the war, as well as the conduct of the military in the war. I wonder, I don't remember, and so I'm interested in your thoughts. Was it ever the case, even during that time of sort of resources and real public attention on the military because we were at war and people cared about the war, that these kinds of stories that Thomas is talking about kind of the lives back home, about the lives of veterans and policy responses to the needs of military families, and was that getting covered? Did that command the public attention?
Really good question, and I think it follows a similar arc. I think in the kind of the early part of the kind of 2010s decade, no, and when it was being covered, it was also being done from a similar position of a lack of awareness and ignorance. A lot of stereotyping, but just a failure to truly understand the very unique challenges that military families are facing, military spouses, military communities were undergoing. I'd like to think that in some newsrooms, over time, that fundamentally changed. Personally, I went from covering both Iraq and Afghanistan to spending a couple of years focused on veterans' issues on the home front, working with my erstwhile colleague David Finkel, and doing some survey research and long-form narrative journalism in this space. There was a moment where there were both resources and attention. We're starting to get it right. And then, sadly, not just in the broader world of national security coverage, but particularly coverage focused on veterans and military families and related issues, the resourcing has just, it's largely evaporated. And we can talk about what is the cost here, because I see the cost as being much more than just one being borne by our veterans and military family community.
So maybe we can, Michèle, maybe I can ask you about the policy side of this a little bit. I think sometimes we get the impression that from the Department of Defense's perspective, the trope of the American hero is a desirable one, that it's in some ways good for PR, that it's maybe good for recruitment, et cetera. And certainly we see, in some ways, the military pushing that trope in its own outward-facing messaging. But I wonder whether, from the perspective of a policymaker, there's also something really problematic just about that trope and the lack of coverage of these sorts of stories. I wonder if there are policy problems that the government would really like to be working on, but because there's not coverage and there's not this ability to leverage public opinion, we're really constrained in our ability to do things we want to do. I don't know, I'm interested in sort of how a policymaker thinks about this set of problems.
Yeah, so I think, it can be a trope, but I also think it comes from a place of genuine pride, understanding the sacrifice and the service that people have given, wearing the nation's cloth and so forth, and wanting to celebrate that. But I do think it hurts the quality of our policymaking when we don't have a public dialogue about the experience of individual service members on active duty, as veterans, and military families. This is all happening in a context of an incredible civil-military divide, which I think is problematic for our democracy. I mean, fewer than 1% of Americans have any family tie to the military. So you have the burden of the all-volunteer forces actually being carried on the shoulders of a really small fraction of Americans. And I like to joke, but it's true, when I showed up for my wedding, half the church, my husband's half, was in uniform, and half the church, my half, had never met anybody in uniform. And that's very common in our society. And I think that hurts us because, first of all, if you have very few Americans serving, the absence of journalistic coverage of the actual human experience of people who do serve puts them at a disadvantage. There's no, that kind of journalism helps bridge that divide, helps at least at a level of empathy or, some understanding, helps people understand how different the experience can be from what they experience as civilians. But the second thing, it's also a question of accountability. I mean, when I think of the War Horses breaking of the Marines United story, that was a very important example of journalism holding the government, holding the Marine Corps in this case, accountable for its behavior. And that then relates to, I think, where you were going with this, is that you have to have an educated, informed, engaged populace if you're going to build constituency and support for getting the policy right. And doing right by our military members and veterans and their families. And when that dialogue is not happening, there's just much more room for us to get it wrong as policymakers.
When we try to wrap our heads around what's happening with regard to coverage of military issues and our veterans, there's a tendency to say, look, this is breaking the faith with those who serve and their families. And we're missing great stories. We're not bringing them into the public discourse. I think that's absolutely right. I don't want to minimize that. But I think there's a bigger issue here, that the failure to more thoroughly shine a light on the current military experience, what our military is doing today and those who are part of it, and importantly, our veterans, what they've done, their lives today, and the associated issues there, I think has incredible costs for our democracy. And I think that this is not just those who are bearing the price here are those who've served and their families. I think that the entire society bears a cost here, and that's something. The stakes here are much greater than just the military community.
Mm-hmm.
Let's explore that a little bit. Interested in all of your thoughts on this. So I think one of the I'm interested in the ways in which this is different during times of war and times of let's say relative peace. I don't know if times of peace is a super meaningful concept anymore, but the times of war still seems like maybe. I think at least since the Vietnam War, there's been this tension in American life about the relationship between the press and the military, where I think policymakers and war planners were acutely aware during the Vietnam War of the ways in which press access to the battlefield and press coverage had a role in shaping public opinion and made life difficult for a certain set of policymakers and perhaps difficult for the war. And I think we've had an evolution of thinking about that in lots of ways. I think we saw an interestingly different approach during Iraq and Afghanistan with things like embedded journalists, which is maybe an interesting both way of informing the public, but also maybe an interesting way for policymakers to try and manage this kind of tension. And so another thing the white paper spent a lot of time thinking about and that you've raised is sort of the way in which press coverage of military life and military affairs, et cetera, has implications for national security. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not simple, right? Like the relationship between press coverage and national security cuts in lots of ways. And so I'd like to explore a little bit with any of you who'd like to speak to it. So how do we think about the press's responsibilities to national security, the ways in which policymakers, the military, and the press do and don't interact successfully in this front, the ways in which that creates tensions for the press, just in exploring this set of issues.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Again, if in a democracy you want to make sure that the public is aware of and engaged in national security policy. And I think journalistic coverage is really important, not only at the strategic level, such as, okay, we are facing a strategic challenge with a more aggressive, authoritarian, competitive China, and therefore there's certain things we need to do in investing in the drivers of our own competitiveness, and we need to step up as a nation, not only at that strategic level, but really looking at how are we following through as a democracy on the promises we make that are essential to ensuring we have a strong military in the future and we have people willing to serve in the future. It goes back to, President Lincoln's, when this sort of starting of the predecessor to the Veterans Administration, which is to basically say, if we don't take care of our veterans and our military families, we're not going to have people willing to serve and sacrifice in the future. And so, making sure that we are making good on those promises is essential, not only to take care of those people and do right by them and sort of do the morally correct thing, but it also speaks to, will we be able to muster people to raise their hand, take an oath to the Constitution and serve in the future if we don't, take care. And that's a very central national security question, and particularly relevant at a time when we are having a no-kidding recruiting crisis in terms of propensity to serve. Some of it is related to, can young people of a certain age meet the military's, physical, mental, moral, educational requirements, but it's also propensity to serve. Are enough Are we able to recruit, the 50% of the population that is women, in an environment where we still haven't solved the sexual assault and sexual harassment problem? Are we able to recruit a representative group of people of color, the diversity in our population, an incredible talent there, in an institution that still hasn't cracked the code on how do you promote and elevate people without regard to race. I mean, I want to be clear, the Pentagon's working very, very hard on this, and I know this secretary, and you're going to be meeting the deputy secretary later, they are all over this. But we still have a lot of progress to go. So I think it is a larger issue, both from a policy perspective of the content of our national security policy, and also making sure we've done right by those who serve to ensure that others will raise their hand and serve in the future.
Yeah.
Two quick. Oh, sorry, Thomas. Go ahead. 2 quick points. The recruiting crisis is really, in my mind, a broader crisis about the engagement of young Americans in service in our country. It's not just the military, it's civilian national service. AmeriCorps is, at 50% or 60% of its slots being filled over the last year. I mean, young Americans of all stripes don't have a sort of an ethos of service today that previous generations did, and we have to ask ourselves, how do we try to inculcate that in a greater way? A week ago, I was speaking at a session with a group of academics, and the subject of media coverage of the Iraq War came up. And the consensus of the people in the room, myself excluded, was the press has been a tool of the military. It was manipulated through the embedding process. Let's just note that while many journalists were embedded during the march up to Baghdad, as soon as that statue was pulled down, most reporters got out of their embeds, and embedding, while occurring during certain military operations, both in Iraq and Afghanistan over those next many years, what happened, it was not the predominant way that most stories were told. But there's a view among people on the political left that the press is overly manipulated by the media, simply tells pro-military stories. And then you talk to people on the political right who say, oh, yeah, the media just focuses on the negative. They're anti-military, they're anti-veteran. And it's like so many other issues in our world today. How you view the role of the press and our military depends on where you sit politically. And I'll just say, from my point of view, I don't think the press has been perfect. You look back, you look at today, there's an awful lot that could be done better. But I think in the main, the view taken by extreme partisans, one side or the other, doesn't reflect the reality of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that, again, veterans and journalists have in common is I think we're idealists, right? Like, when we serve in the military, we want to make it better for the people that are inheriting the military. I think that journalism also wants to continue making the industry better for the people, not only that we serve in our communities, but in industry as a whole. I would love to see, Michèle, you talked about promises not being kept and stuff. I think the average American expects America to be the best military and deliver on all those promises, but they would be incredibly disappointed if they knew that, like, they're not adhering to brilliance in the basics. Like, some computers don't work. People can't send emails. We're putting gasoline in people's, drinking water in Hawaii. Like, there's all these things that impact the individual, and then we wonder why we struggle with recruiting and we struggle with retention, and why we have people who aren't interested in public service. And I think it's because too often we take a look at the higher level policy issues and don't look at the implications that has on the individuals on the ground. Like, I get treated 2 different ways when I go out into public. If I wear a Marine Corps sweatshirt, I hear one thing from people. If I wear a journalism sweatshirt, I hear something completely different. And it's very, you get stereotyped a lot being in either one of those camps. So I think that if journalists can start to explore how what promises we aren't keeping, and from a boots on the ground perspective, I think that not only will we repair the journalism industry and get people to trust us a bit more, but we can also help to show people that while the military is a flawed institution, it's full of people who do want to make it better and who are following a call to serve and see it as an opportunity to do something bigger than themselves, again, which is something that's in common with journalism. So I think we both got to come to the table and have hard conversations and move things forward.
I've heard both of you say this interesting thought about there's this role of the press in civic life that, and you've put it in slightly different ways, but I think closely related, about helping people understand this set of issues that they might care about if they knew about them, and that might play an important role in democratic accountability and in changing policy and the like. And this idea of public spiritedness, some sort of sense of service, some sense of solidarity with your fellow country people, with some obligation to your society and your community, to serve in various ways, that might run from AmeriCorps to the military, and maybe even sort of an obligation to the country. I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth in terms of helping to solve that problem. My sense from both of you and from others is that journalists in general feel that kind of public spiritedness. That would be my guess. And yet I hear you both saying we're not kind of getting there. And part of that, I'm sure, is the kind of business model problems that Rajiv started us with. But if we started to think about solutions, if we started to think about moving the needle a little bit on those kinds of problems, other than calling them out by name, what might that look like? What could happen in the industry, in society, that would help us do better on that front?
I'll start with maybe sort of a little bit of agree and disagree with the white paper. Look, I think it would be great if the New York Times and the Washington Post and major television news outlets increased resources in covering military and veterans issues. But we can hope and hope. I don't think that's a great strategy. But even if that happened, how many people would see that coverage? How would it, would that really break through in an era when, quite frankly, orders of magnitude more people get their news from their Facebook feeds than the front page of the New York Times? So what's the solution here? And I think that a focus on, hey, how do we encourage large news organizations to do more here? I don't think really gets at it. So if that's where I disagree, where I agree, is I think, for instance, what the War Horse is doing and nonprofit models here are one critical area of not just experimentation, but it's now showing us to be a proven model and ways, places that we need to double down on. So I think there's that, and I think that we have to start thinking more creatively about how can, particularly in the veteran community, individuals become more of their own storytellers. How do we harness the media environment that we live in to be able to share more of the stories that want to be shared? Now, admittedly, that's one element of this. That's never, you're never going to, in giving people greater tools to their own storytelling, you're not going to get to the sort of the necessary investigative and accountability journalism we need to see. And that's, I think, where these new models of journalism are so important. So I guess just to say, I think that we should spend more time focusing on how do we create more war horses as opposed to how do we get the New York Times to restart its book. A bigger war horse, great. Yeah. As opposed to how do we get the New York Times to, increase its coverage. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like the idea of a bigger war horse for sure. Again, like I don't think that War Horse is going to inspire the New York Times to relaunch its At War blog. I mean, I was someone who got my start because of that. Like the team there, they helped give so many veterans voice and military families throughout the wars. But I think that right now we have a decline in leadership, we have a decline in trust. Like there's so many issues within the news industry. I think that just War Horse being a leader in that space and helping to show people that you can cover these issues in a way that aren't sensational and really do focus on trying to identify solutions and propel people forward to make the military and the world a better place. I think that behaving that way as a newsroom is going to help to reinvigorate the Fourth Estate and help to, I mean, I was a Marine. I hated journalists when I was in uniform. We were told to stay away from them and stay in your lane and not engage. And it took me getting out and being at a distance to see the benefit that they bring to the military. My hope is that not only can the War Horse really help show the public that journalism can do better and that we're an example of that, but to also help the military understand that we have a vital role and we're not there to tear the system down or vilify the individual. It's really just like them. We're public servants that are trying to make our country better and trying to make the ecosystem the communities that we live in stronger. So long-winded answer, but.
So, Michèle, we've talked about coverage of military affairs, talk about the military in the press seems down. I have a prediction, which is that that next year we're going to talk a fair bit about the military because we're going to have a presidential election. Mm-hmm. And politicians like to wrap themselves in the military. I'm sure we are going to talk some, at least, maybe a fair bit about the Afghanistan withdrawal. We're going to maybe talk about aid to Ukraine a lot. I think the military is going to be in the news in some important ways, but it's going to be in the news in a very politicized way. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in your thoughts about the ways in which politics enters into this discussion that we're having about the press and society and the military. We've had a high-minded vision of democratic accountability, and if people knew, they might be able to have an influence in policy in a way that we like to envision when we're optimistic about democracy. But we're in a little bit of a pessimistic mood about democracy these days, mm-hmm. And we're also in a highly politicized environment, and our politics feel like they've gotten more divisive, and they feel like they've gotten a little more cynical. How is politics making itself felt in this space, and yeah. What are the risks?
I do think we are in a challenging time that is going to get worse in the run-up to the presidential election. We're living in a period of profound polarization, but also profound polarization within the media and how the media covers issues of national security and military issues. One of the dangers I really worry about is the impacts of that polarization and political environment on the military as an institution. I mean, historically, the military has been one of the most respected institutions in the country. That's starting to change in some polling. It's also been seen as largely apolitical, which is very, very important for our democracy. People who serve take an oath not to a particular president or any particular party or person, but to support and defend the Constitution of the United States on behalf of the American people. When you have political conventions where retired generals are standing up giving speeches for a particular candidate or political party, it's kind of sending a pretty confusing message. I wish that practice would stop, but I'm not naive enough to think that it will. It's like, it's sort of an arms race between who can line up more people in uniform on the stage to endorse their candidacy. But I think we're playing with fire there. We're suggesting that the military is involved in partisan politics, and it shouldn't be. Similarly, as heading into this period, one of the challenges is when you have really good investigative journalism that is completely nonpartisan, the risk is it's going to be picked up by more partisan outlets and used to say, another thing for Republican candidates to bash the administration with, or the Democratic candidate to bash the previous Trump administration for whatever. And so I think that there is a risk that the good work of organizations like the War Horse could be sort of misused in that political context, and that's kind of a disservice to all of us. But so I don't know what the solution to this is at the moment. But I do worry about the degree to which these issues will be used as political weapons in the next year or two.
Just to build on that, look, I completely agree with you about retired generals showing up at political conventions, and and a lot of the fault here goes to actually civilian political leaders who want to, embrace, want to be wrapped in that halo. We're never going to be able to constrain political candidates and those who hold political office from pontificating about military and national security issues, and very often shading the truth as they do that. I think a big cost here of bringing this back to media coverage, when we have less and less thoughtful, objective coverage of national security issues, be it, for instance, what really happened with the Afghan withdrawal and how many people really were sort of tracking it, right? People lose, even those smart people, engaged people, they lose a frame of reference to then interpret the comments and arguments and claims made by political candidates and leaders, one side or the other, when you have no basis. And so then the very partisan view of this starts to take hold, or their arguments do, and people have no way of trying to ascertain for themselves, is what this person's saying really true or not?
And I also think that the small unit leaders in the military also have some responsibility here too. When I was serving back in 2004 during that election period, I saw people wearing political T-shirts or having a sticker on their car or something like that, and the sticker was very quickly scraped off, and the T-shirt was ripped from their body, and it was explained to them that this is apolitical. Like, we do not endorse political candidates in this. I drive on base now as a retiree, and I've seen Marines wearing political shirts. I've seen the stickers on the back of cars and the flags and arguably people advertising for extremist groups on base. A lot of the groups that we saw January 6th, like, there's people with those stickers on their cars on military bases around the country. So I think that some of this also falls on the small unit leaders, not to sound like too much of a sergeant, but it's the corporals and the sergeants and the NCO, it's those small unit leaders that need to be holding the boots on the ground accountable for some of these things. Just like the senior leaders need to say, this is not how we behave. This is risky. We're playing with fire here with politicizing the military. So I think that it's, journalism has to do better, but small unit leaders and then also the big policymakers need to make it clear that you're playing with fire when you mix the military with politics.
At any of those levels, at the level of press coverage of these issues, at the level of military leadership, or at the level of policy, are we doing good work to reestablish norms, or are these norms, has the train left the station in the same way as lots of our other norms of democratic life, and we don't see a way to get them back?
Yeah, I'm also, in addition to being a military spouse, I'm now a military mom, which is much more nerve-wracking. I hear stories that there's actually really serious effort within the ranks to communicate the importance of that there are norms, and that it's important, to keep the military out of politics. I remember my son, when he was graduating from the Naval Academy, they had an hour, a briefing on, when the president comes to speak, what do you do? Can you stand? Can you clap? Can you cheer? What are the appropriate ways to behave so that you're not sort of used as a pawn and it doesn't look like a political rally, but you're also, respecting the office of the President of the United States is coming to speak to you. Inside units, he's a young officer, and these very issues, how do you deal with people who are in very open way expressing political views or support for groups that may not be, that are very political or not appropriate or extremist even. All of these things come down to that junior leader level to say, okay, how do we actually do this? And I actually think there is a very live conversation, at least in the community he's in, about what's the right way to, both respect someone's, rights as a citizen, but also ensure they understand the norms of behavior when you wear the nation's cloth.
I actually have much more faith that the military is attuned to this, and as Michèle is describing, starting to get this right, than I do the broader civilian population. I think that in the main, members of the military from lowest ranks to the highest have a much keener sense of what it means to live in a country where we have civilian control of a military, where a military is supposed to be apolitical. It doesn't always happen. We have our retired generals, we have our pockets of extremism, but I would posit that those are the exceptions rather than the rule.
Yeah.
I think, though, one of the consequences of a dearth of coverage of our military and just the lack of thoughtful reporting that ordinary people see in their course of their lives through the multiplicity of ways they receive information, is leading to ordinary people perhaps coming away thinking that our military is either more politicized than it is, that the role of the military is actually not what our founders enshrined. And I think there are deep, long-term consequences for the future health of our all-volunteer force in that.
I mean, this is related to your point, I think, about political perceptions of war coverage, right? So it seems inevitable that, Abu Ghraib is a bigger story than the story about anything else, more or less about it. And so you get this, right, maybe the whole military is, at least from one side, political side, maybe the whole military is corrupt and behaving in these atrocious manners. And in the same way, veterans or active duty military showing up at January 6th is a bigger story and will inevitably capture more of the public attention than the story of everyday life. And so I wonder how one this newsworthiness thing creates a real tension there, right? It's hard to get people to read the story about flood damage on a military base that hasn't been repaired, as opposed to the story about January 6th. But I want to hear your thoughts on sort of the reestablishing of norms.
I think norms are changing, but I'm hopeful. I don't think that all hope is definitely not lost. I think that you are going to continue to have leaders in the military that do the right thing and make sure that the service members around them are doing the right thing. We're having a lot of difficult conversations about the military right now, and people are, whether it's the Abu Ghraib story or if it's Walter Reed or a story about the Veterans Administration, like with the Phoenix scandal from years ago, I think that it's the violation of trust. I think that is what unifies people for those stories and kind of makes them more newsworthy. And when it comes to like the shifting of norms, I think that instead of focusing on the sensationalized, ends of the spectrum, that if we can focus on those violations of trust, we can get back to that center and maintain some of the norms that we're drifting away from a little bit. But I'm hopeful.
You're all so optimistic. It's lovely.
It's weird for an investigative reporter to admit that.
Yeah. Where we spend a lot of time thinking about our role in reestablishing norms, and we don't feel so optimistic. So, before we turn to questions, let me just ask you each, if you could identify one story, this would be like, but one thing that you feel like written, not getting the attention it needs in this space?
Oof. Just one?
Or 10?
Just one. Man, you want to go first there, Rajiv? I think that it's, wow. I think it's about military children, honestly. I think that we really need to have a much more honest conversation about the impacts of military service on the children that live on our bases and experience military service firsthand. The military is a family industry, and I think that we've put children through hell for the last 20 years with war, and I think we're going to see that play into the recruiting crisis moving forward. So I'd really like to see military kids and the way that they're impacted by military service talked about more.
Last week there were 3 Navy SEAL suicides. We have not cracked the code on this problem. The level of suicide in the military and the veterans community is still much higher than in the civilian side, and that is not a new story. But I do think that both the VA and the Department of Defense have tried to increase access to mental health care and so forth. But there are still real problems in the system that mean that in crisis, people are still not getting to the quality and the sort of rapidity of care. I mean, the time urgent care of quality that they need, and there's still a huge stigma against accessing that care. So I don't want to suggest that we haven't made a large effort and that we're not making progress, but it is not, the statistics are telling us it is not enough, and there are good solutions out there that the system is still not endorsing and supporting and enabling for folks who are suffering. So I would like to see us really dig into, what progress have we made, why aren't we having more success, and what more can be done?
I guess my answer would be a version of that, maybe in a slightly broader lens, which is the continued civ-mil divide in our society, and the how a small percentage of American families are dealing with the costs and consequences of military service, either current or over the past generation, in ways that are just completely not understood by 95+% of American families. And despite a lot of good work over the years, that simply still hasn't broken through. And I come back to, I think there's a long-term cost for our society when that's not addressed.
So, the clock is moving. We'd like to open it up to questions. And I believe there's somebody here to moderate or with a microphone. Am I right about that? Awesome.
Don't be shy. Anybody? Oh, we got one right there.
Couple in.
So Lydia will head up with the microphone. If you don't mind meeting us sort of in that middle section, just because of the microphone's range. But we'll start off with a question from our live stream. What do journalists need in order to diversify their sources, including and beyond veterans and military families, in order to better challenge or more holistically cover the governmental status quo on issues of war and peace?
So how do they build better sourcing on that?
Yes,
Okay.
Diversify their sources.
I think it's really just about shoe leather reporting. I mean, getting out there and talking to people, admitting what you don't know, and just naturally being curious. regardless of what veteran or, I'll admit, it's easier sometimes for me to call as a veteran and a Marine. There's that automatic trust that's kind of built in. I don't know if the person's a veteran themselves or have any military affiliation, but I think it's just, again, like any reporting project, admitting what you know, admitting what you don't know, and treating people the way that you want to be treated, and arguably just being fearless in who you reach out to. I mean, this whole event here is built on a crazy idea and asking people to be involved. Tenacity is what I would say to building a more diverse network of sources. Rajiv?
Real quickly, I mean, it's tenacity. I think it's also the ability to take some time to more thoughtfully learn issues. I mean, I recognize we're at a wonderful academic setting here where people in academia have at times lots of time to burrow into stuff, create probably healthy tension in the academy, how much time people would take. But when you think about a newsroom and you think about journalists today, even compared to when I was in the trenches, the rush to have a hot take out there, to quickly get something out on social media, to quickly post something, the time gets ever more compressed. And it's not just the time to talk to a variety of people, it's a time to really just try to understand what you're covering. And we're moving in a worrisome way much more toward sort of quick stenography than deeper interpretation, analysis, and then thoughtful conveyance of the facts, but with some necessary context.
Hi. I was wondering if you could discuss trends, if there are any, in international media covering the American military, both private international media organizations or state-owned media organizations, any that report on these issues well, or any that report on these issues in a way that maybe deserves counter-messaging or other actions by domestic media?
Internationally. I mean, I think that who immediately comes to mind as an organization that I think is really uniquely positioned to participate in that is like the Global Investigative Journalism Network and collaborations like them. I really think that they have a way of rallying people together, like the Panama Papers and other projects like that outside of the U.S. I know that I'm drawing a blank on it, there's a good organization in they cover air raids and bombing, and they're in the UK somewhere. I'm drawing a blank on the name. But yeah, I think the Global Investigative Journalism Network and other collaborative organizations that bring together journalists with different expertise are really kind of leading the way in international reporting that focuses on broader issues like that. Sorry, I didn't have a more specific example.
I would just add that unfortunate trend that in a number of authoritarian countries, whether it's Russian media coverage of the military action or the war in Ukraine, or Chinese reporting, state media reporting on the glories of the PLA. I mean, it's done through the lens of state propaganda. And so it's very, very tough to get fact-based and journalism on those topics, and let alone and woe be to the person who's critical in their point of view or points out problems. So I think as you have that spread of or strengthening of authoritarianism in some environments, you have a corresponding degradation of the quality of any kind of truthful reporting on their military issues.
And a consequence of that, real quickly, is that when you get outside of Russia or China, but you go to third countries, you think about other European countries, Africa, other parts of Asia, that state propaganda actually travels.
Yeah.
RT is watched in a number of different countries, right? Their video products get repackaged and conveyed by other either state and non-state media actors. And so as Western outlets, particularly American outlets, are devoting fewer resources to covering this stuff, it creates a vacuum that state-owned actors fill in a particularly pernicious way in other parts of the world.
Good morning. I'm Barb Carson, Syracuse University Institute for Veterans and Military Families. I wanted to tie together a few threads that we've had and bring it down from the international to the local level with communities and the lack of small town journalism, the Civ Mill divide, military children, and the 50th anniversary of the all-volunteer force is here and at risk. So if you could please help us think of ways with these military children who are the greatest source of new recruits, have just endured, Thomas, as you said, a really rough 20 years of deploying parents. They would love to serve publicly, but what story are we able to tell them as we leave active duty? And one more piece would be the National Guard and Reserve. That local connection to military service that is quite unlike those communities that send someone off to active duty for 20 plus years, and what they bring home and how they tell their story. So I'm interested in what do you see as a national security issue that communities can participate in the risk of no small town journalism?
Wow. Wow, that was a good question. I think that, so I would like to see military kids be brought into the conversation more with military leaders, military families. I think the only way that you really start to understand what people have gone through is when you bring them to the table and listen to them. And I don't think military families have largely been actually listened to by the military. So I would like to see, civilian, one thing that Camp Lejeune did very well when I was a reporter down there, and I'm unsure if it still goes on, but they would bring together base leaders, local leaders from Onslow County, they'd bring in the veteran service organizations, and they would talk about the broader issues, and there would be that, I think it was monthly or quarterly, I can't recall, but they would have that deliberate moment where they would talk about the problems, whether it was sexual assault or, transition issues and jobs out in town, military spouses not being able to, there are so many military spouses that are way overqualified for the jobs that are available in military communities, but they would have that conversation. So I think, I hesitate to say the simplest solution, but I think it's making a deliberate effort to bring people together and get those people at the table so that not only the DoD, but the broader public can understand what their perspective is, what their hesitations are for joining, and to better understand what's going on within the military community itself. Because they've experienced the base schools. And if you think military families don't think about how well their children are going to be educated, just like the rest of the population does, you're wrong. They care about the base schools. They care about the hospitals and the quality of health care that they're getting there. Military bases are just a microcosm of the country. Could you remind me of the second half of your question, though?
National Guard and Reserve and that community connection to this.
Okay. So when it comes to the National Guard, I think one of the biggest issues that we need to realize is that, so I'll give all the credit to, well, I think it was Dave LePan who said it. All military kids, whether it's National Guard or active duty, do not care if it's a deployment to Afghanistan or a deployment to the southern border. Mom and dad are just gone. So I think that and a lot of the families, if you are in the National Guard, you might be a lawyer or work at McDonald's. Any job is possible, right? So, and those people don't live in military communities with the healthcare and the mental health and the community resources and all the things that the traditional military has. So I think we need to have, again, a tough conversation about the realities for the National Guard and those families and what they go through, because people just don't understand. I hope that answered your question, kinda.
What are some things the military can do on their part to kind of better bridge that divide? Part of the why behind this question is, as a young Marine public affairs officer, my biggest frustration was commanders who were risk adverse and unwilling or just didn't want to share information with the media, whether it be some criminal misconduct or even some of the goodness we were doing. And so I think the best thing for me is when the Secretary of the Navy released a memo kind of directing commanders to be more transparent with information and bring more media on base. So I guess two-part question is there anything like that could be looked at doing? And then from the media's perspective, what could the military do better?
I would say that having, it be an expected duty of a commander to do the kind of community engagement on a, regular basis. Like, we're going to come, we're going to hear from different stakeholders, we're going to acknowledge issues that we're working with and how we need to work on them together. I do think better access for the press, but one of the things that we don't do very well is train our commanders in how to deal with the press. I mean, often, the number of general officers I've seen thrown into a press conference or thrown into congressional testimony for the first time with very little preparation. They've been busy doing operational things, and now suddenly, well, at this rank, you should know automatically, magically know how to deal with the press and with Congress and so forth. I think we owe it to them to have a lot more professional development and training. But I also think getting more on the recruitment side and bridging the civil-military divide, I think if every military member, went back to their home community to talk about their experience and demystify the military to their home community, that's a huge help. I mean, my son came from a suburban public high school. He's the first person to go to a military academy in living memory, but every year since then, he's come back, he's, stayed in touch. Every year since then, some number of kids have applied to the academy. So much of the recruiting, I think, could be helped by people going back home and talking about, they can be truth-telling, but, hopefully talking about why they serve and what having a mission-focused career is like. And the benefits of that, I think that could help a lot. And if military members each took that as a responsibility to go personally bridge that divide in any way that you can.
Real quickly, I think this starts with senior leaders creating the right expectations. And we have a double standard. If you're a battalion commander out at war and you got a mission, a kinetic mission to go and, take an objective, and you encounter some casualties, right? That's the cost of being at war. And, a battalion commander isn't going to get, beaten up by his colonel for that. You take a little risk with a journalist, and all of a sudden that story, not every operation turns out to be, a kinetic operation turns out to be totally successful. Not every media engagement, perhaps in the eyes of the military, will turn out to be successful. But there's a zero defect mentality, right? So there's an expectation in so many other aspects of military operations that you can take acceptable risk. But you take risk in engaging with the media, and it doesn't go your way, you are your host. And that attitude has to change if you want to expect, field grade and below officers, and even general officers, to want to more thoughtfully engage with the press.
Yeah. I think commanders need to be told that another thing that we have in common is journalists want to get it right. We don't want to get it wrong. We hate running corrections. So like the commander and the reporter both have that in common. We want the story to have the context it needs. We want the story to be as accurate as it can be. So I think if you communicate that to your commanders, that might help.
I almost never disagree with Thomas. I agree with that, but it's also knowing your journalists.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
There are gotcha journalists. You don't want to grant them. You don't want to have the Rolling Stone come embed in your unit and experience what General McChrystal experienced. I mean, and he had responsibility for some of what happened there too. But my point is, you have to choose. You have to find the Thomas Brennans of the world and the Rajivs of the world and work with them. But that takes a sophistication to understand who's a serious journalist who wants to get the story right versus who's a gotcha journalist that just wants to make a quick headline and throw someone into the bus.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a stimulating discussion.